What a spectacular few days this has been. I join all of those who've been a part of this, and particularly our incredible hosts at Colonial Williamsburg and VA 250 in expressing our thanks for everything. Thank you all for making the journey, for spending the time focused on collaboration and our shared aspiration. We and our nation will be the better for it, for the relationships that have been nurtured over these past few days, and for the vision that I can feel is coalescing around our efforts for America's 250th. For all of you who joined us last year, you'll recall the passionate words of our next speaker were a great highlight. In fact, we now can look back and realize that we were fortunate enough to get an early sampling, a taste of his then forthcoming, now successfully published book. Jeffrey Rosen is the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center, where he hosts We the People, a very popular weekly podcast of constitutional debate. He's also a professor of law at the George Washington University Law School and a contributing editor to The Atlantic. Jeff's new book, The Pursuit of Happiness, how classical writers on virtue inspired the lives of the founders and defined America, is tremendous and worth a read. So are his other books, including New York Times bestseller Conversations with RBG, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, on life, love, liberty, and law, as well as biographies on Louis Brandeis and William Howard Taft. His words are so fitting, I think, as we come to a close with our gathering and we speak to the ways in which the ideas of America can still inspire today. And those roots are so evident in everything he does in his wonderful research. I hope you'll all please join me in a very warm welcome for Jeffrey Rosen.
Thank you so much, and hello, friends. It is so meaningful to be here to close out this incredibly inspiring convening. Thanks so much to Carly and Cliff and Virginia 250 for hosting us, and thanks to all of you for convening. The reason we are here is because we are all joined in an urgently important mission, and that is to inspire Americans to learn about and embrace the principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And I just found last week a remarkable passage from John Quincy Adams that sums up the urgency of our mission better than any words I've seen. And this is Quincy Adams in 1839, and it's the Jubilee of the Constitution, the 50th anniversary of Washington taking the oath as president, and he's talking about how important it is to teach the next generation the principles of the Declaration and Independence, and in fact says that future generations will be blessed or cursed depending on their adherence to or rejection of the principles of the Declaration. And then here are his words. Lay up these principles then in your hearts and in your souls. Bind them for signs upon your hands, that they may be as frontlets between your eyes. Teach them to your children, speaking of them when sitting in your houses, when walking by the way, when lying down and rising up. Write them upon the doorposts of your houses and upon your gates. Cling to them as to the issues of life. Adhere to them as to the cords of your eternal salvation. So in other words, we can't mess it up. It is very important that we teach these principles, and Quincy Adams and many great predecessors throughout American history have been convinced that unless Americans learn about and embrace the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution, the Republic will collapse. And these are very challenging times, and I see some nodding, and our task is both celebratory and commemorative, but also preservative of American democracy. So that's the job we have ahead, and I know from the convening that we've just had that all of us are doing our part in pulling together in really inspiring ways, and that's exactly what we're going to do together. I will close off by talking to you this morning about my unusual reading project that led me to learn more about one of the important principles of the Declaration, in particular, the pursuit of happiness. And then I'll talk about what I learned about how different founders applied those principles in their lives, and then come back to John Quincy Adams and send everyone off, hopefully with a spring in your step. So as I began to talk about last year, it was during COVID that I set out to read the ancient books of moral philosophy that inspired the founders in their understanding of the pursuit of happiness. And this came about through a series of unusual synchronicities. First, I was rereading the section in Ben Franklin's autobiography where he said that in his 20s, he resolved to achieve moral perfection. And he did this by making a list of 12 virtues. He saved the one he found hardest for last and added it at the suggestion of a Quaker friend. He started with temperance, prudence, order, resolution, and at the end he added humility. And he made a list of these 13 virtues down one side of the page, and then he put the days of the week on the other side. And each week he resolved to focus on a particular virtue and make a self-accounting every night about whether or not he'd lived up to the virtue in question. So he tried this for a while and put X marks on the days that he fell short, for example, of temperance or resolution and order. He tried it for a while. He found it was incredibly depressing because there were so many X marks. And he eventually gave it up, but he felt better for having tried. He felt that it was a useful exercise in self-examination. I knew about this system because a few years ago, a friend and I had tried it at the suggestion of a rabbi in Washington, D.C. Our rabbi had said, you've got to try this system called Musar, or character improvement. And what we didn't know then is it's the Franklin system translated into Hebrew. Basically, a Hasidic rabbi in 1808 liked Franklin, translated the virtues into Hebrew, and offered it up to Jewish practitioners, and it's still practiced today. So without knowing that it was the Franklin system, we tried it for a while, and every night we'd pick every week we'd pick a different virtue, and every night we'd put an X mark where we fell short. We, like Franklin, found it incredibly depressing. And we also gave it up after a while, but felt that we were improved for having tried. It was during COVID that I saw that Franklin had chosen as the motto for his project a passage by Cicero from a book I'd never heard of called the Tusculan Disputations. And it said, without virtue, happiness cannot be. What struck me about that passage is a few weeks later, I was at the Boar's Head Inn in Charlottesville on the UVA campus. And on the wall was a list of 12 virtues that Thomas Jefferson had drafted for his daughters. And this list, which I hadn't seen before, was remarkably similar to Franklin. Jefferson chose virtues like resolution, resolve to do what you ought and do what you resolve. Silence, when angry, count to 10, when very angry, 100. What was striking here, though, is that Jefferson, too, chose as his motto for the pursuit of virtue this passage from Cicero, from the Tusculan Disputations. And when Jefferson was old and people would write to him and say, what's the meaning of happiness? He would send this passage. And the passage said something like, he who has achieved a tranquility of soul, who is neither exalted by wanton exaltation or despondent by undue despondency, he is the wise man of whom we are in quest. He is the happy man. Very striking. The Cicero book is actually a book on grief. And Cicero wrote it to console himself when his daughter Tullia died. And it was striking that Jefferson chose as his core wisdom on happiness this passage from this grief self-help manual by Cicero. So I thought, I've got to read Cicero because he was so important to Franklin and Jefferson. What else to read? Then I found this amazing reading list that Jefferson would send to kids who were going to law school or people who wrote him when he was old, asking how to be an educated person. And this reading list, which he first sent to Robert Skipwith, has an extraordinarily rigorous reading schedule. You have to get up before dawn, read moral philosophy before sunrise, watch the sunrise, then in the morning, political philosophy, and history, and then lunch, and you're allowed some science and astronomy and light mathematics, and then dinner, and then Shakespeare as reward and a bit of literature, and then to bed, reading 12 hours a day. What really caught my eye was the section called Ethics or Natural Religion. And at the top of that section, there were 10 books, was Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, and then Cicero's On Duties, and then Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus, as well as some Enlightenment moral philosophers, not only Locke's essay concerning human understanding, but Francis Hutcheson and Lord Bolingbroke and Hume and Keynes. I felt that I had to read these books because it was a gap in my education. I've had the most wonderful liberal arts education and have studied literature and politics and history and law with great teachers at great universities, and I'm grateful every day of my life for the extraordinary teachers and education I had, but somehow I just missed these books. Why? How, with all of my elaborate education, could I have missed them? It's because although I studied political philosophy and literature and so forth, it was these core books of moral philosophy from ancient Greece and Rome and from the Enlightenment that had just fallen out of the curriculum by the time I was in college in the 80s. And I have to share that I remember in the 80s yearning for this kind of guidance about how to lead a purpose-driven life. I was studying the Puritans as an English major, and I was completely unconvinced by the rigors of Puritan theology, which said that salvation could only be achieved not only by blind faith and good works, but even faith and good works could not save you if you hadn't been predestined at birth to heaven rather than hell. It was a rather rigorous message, and it wasn't working for me, in addition to the fact that I'm Jewish. And I wondered whether a good life could be achieved by reason rather than revelation, by reflection rather than authority and blind faith or predestination. And what I didn't realize is, because these books had fallen out of the curriculum, is this is exactly the question that the ancient philosophers had set out to answer. So during COVID, I developed this unusual reading schedule. I'd inspired by Jefferson, got up before dawn, would read for 2 hours in the morning, watch the sunrise, and then I found myself writing sonnets to sum up the wisdom that I just read. And I realized that this sounds extremely weird, and I never expected to be doing it, but then I learned later that all sorts of people in the founding era and later who read this great wisdom wrote sonnets as well, including Phyllis Wheatley, the great Black poet, Mercy Otis Warren, Alexander Hamilton, and then John Quincy Adams, who, as you can tell from the opening quote, has become one of my great heroes, would spend his morning in the White House, wake up, read Cicero in the original, in particular the Tusculan Disputations, which was his favorite book, watch the sunrise, write sonnets, and then walk along the Potomac. And his sonnets are really good. So that's what I did, and that was my COVID reading project, and I read for a year to try to understand how the founders understood the pursuit of happiness. And what I learned came as a revelation. First, almost all of the books on Jefferson's reading list contain the phrase, the pursuit of happiness. The marvel of electronic word searches, all of this stuff is free and online, and I just searched the documents and saw there it was in Locke's essay concerning human understanding, in Hume's essays, in Francis Hutcheson, and in the English translations recommended by Jefferson of Seneca. In addition, all of the sources agree on the meaning of the pursuit of happiness. For the founders, and for the ancients, and for most of human history, happiness meant not feeling good, but being good. Not the pursuit of pleasure, but the pursuit of virtue. And in particular, all of these sources have an understanding of virtue that is unfamiliar today. It involves self-mastery, self-improvement, character improvement, being your best self, being, we would say today, a lifelong learner, always open to reading and learning and growing so that you can use your talents to the best of your abilities and serve others. And in particular, the ancients and Enlightenment saw the pursuit of virtue as a dramatic struggle between reason and passion. It all comes back, amazingly, to Pythagoras, who I had admired as the inventor of the triangle and am so grateful even more for his invention of the harmonic system, and all of our beautiful triads and fifths come from Pythagoras. But in addition to all that, he was a great sage who lived on the island of Croton, encouraged his disciples to be perfect, to be good, and then become a god, and always to reverence thyself. And the way to achieve self-reverence was by rigorous self-mastery. And Pythagoras distinguished between reason in the head and passion or emotion in the heart and desire in the stomach, and suggested that we use our powers of reason to moderate our unreasonable passions and emotions so that we can achieve the calm, tranquility, moderation, wisdom that defines virtue. Remember, the four classical virtues are prudence, temperance, courage, and justice. And by moderating our unreasonable emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear, we can achieve that prudence and temperance of the soul that defines happiness. So now I could understand the Jefferson quotation in a different light. Cicero is urging that self-mastery is the best way to deal with grief and to use our talents to the best of their ability, and it's all embodied in this battle between reason and passion. It was just a remarkable insight to understand what Aristotle meant in the Nicomachean Ethics when he famously defines happiness as an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue. And virtue and excellence are not self-defining, so those terms I'd always found confusing. But after reading what's essentially classical moral psychology, I could understand that it's a lifelong quest for character improvement so that we can be our best self and serve others. So that was my COVID reading project. It was a revelation. It changed my conception of how to be a good person and also how to be a good citizen, because I learned that the founders, like the ancients, drew a connection between personal self-government and political self-government, and thought that unless we could master our unreasonable and turbulent emotions like anger and jealousy and fear as individuals, we couldn't productively govern ourselves in a republic. And I read the Federalist Papers in an entirely new light and came to see the relationship between the pursuit of happiness in the Declaration and the structures of the Constitution in a new light as well. The book tries to ask how the founders applied these lessons in their own lives. Of course, telling stories of people is the best way to learn about history, and it's an important question. How did these men and women who thought that self-mastery and virtue was key to private and public happiness practice these virtues? And it was so remarkable and relatable, if I can use that word, to see that they talked constantly about their efforts to master their unreasonable emotions and passions so that they could try to be virtuous. They were always beating themselves up for falling short. They were well aware of their own hypocrisies, in particular about slavery, which I'll talk about in a moment in the context of Jefferson. But it was extraordinary mindfulness, and it was moral seriousness that led them to be trying to become more perfect throughout their lives. The book starts with Franklin, of course, because he's the one who came up with the 13 virtue system, and as it happens, printed in 1757 the edition of Wollaston's sermons that contain the phrase, the pursuit of happiness. And Franklin was also a great champion of the American Samuel Johnson, a moral philosopher who wrote the kind of moral textbook for the American Revolution, which was the beginning of the University of Pennsylvania curriculum, which uses the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, a lot and talks about the need for self-mastery. And Franklin, at the end of his life, attributes his success in life to his conciliatory temperament, to the tranquility of mind that allowed him to master his own turbulent emotions and to bring about compromise and conciliation. A remarkable confession from the great Franklin, the most famous man in the world, acclaimed with Voltaire for taming the Gulf Stream and harnessing lightning. he thinks his success came from his temperament and his efforts for character improvement. John and Abigail Adams are just a great way to test these virtues because they talked about it so frequently. And in fact, it was Burlamaqui and Epictetus who was their courtship reading. They would read Epictetus together, and together they decided to practice the Franklin system, which they got from Pythagoras, the same place where Franklin got it. And while they were courting, they made lists of their own faults. And John notes his most famous one, vanity. I'm obnoxious and disliked, that cannot be denied, as we all know from the musical. And Abigail says, no, people are just intimidated by you because you're so forbidding. But as for my faults, I haven't been reading enough, and I didn't do my daily Bible reading, and also I'm pigeon-toed and my posture isn't very good. And Adams comments on that, and she says a gentleman should never comment on the posture of a lady, but it's remarkable that was what bound them together, was their acts of Pythagorean or Franklin-like self-accounting. John Adams is a tremendously relatable founder because although famously vain, he proposes that the president be called His Elected Majesty, and he is himself mocked as his rotundity, and he's constantly complaining that he's not getting enough credit for the American Revolution, and he's the one who actually wrote the Declaration, and he talks about himself in the third person and is always ragging on Franklin, the grand Franklin, who's getting all the credit. Despite all that, he is very self-aware, and he knows about his excesses. The story of his break and reconciliation with two great founders, Mercy Otis Warren and Thomas Jefferson, is especially moving. Mercy Otis Warren is a remarkably inspiring woman, the poet of the Revolution, as Adams called her, because of the satires that she wrote at his request, making fun of the British and inspiring the rebels. She's classically educated. She can't go to Harvard like her brothers, because women aren't allowed to then, but she is educated with James Otis in the classics. She reads Cicero and the moral philosophy, and that leads her to write these beautiful poems of virtue, including when James Otis loses his reason, this gorgeous poem that the light of reason is extinguished. And then she writes these plays, and she and Adams are close. They fall out over the main issue that divided Federalists and Anti-Federalists in the Revolution, and that's the nature of national power. That central dispute between Hamilton and Jefferson, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, between states' rights and national government, defines all of our politics and constitutional disputes ever since. And Mercy writes an anti-Federalist history of the American Revolution that criticizes Adams in 5 pages, both for supporting the resurrection of monarchy, which was the anti-Federalist charge against him, and for being vain and pompous and losing his temper. And this leads him to vainly and pompously lose his temper. And he storms, how dare you accuse the grand Adams of, doing this? And they go on, and the letters are getting more and more heated. And finally, she's had enough, and she says, all thoughts of warmth are extinguished in the bosom who used to sign herself with affection, Mercy Otis Warren. So they don't talk for years. Abigail arranges a reconciliation. She sends locks of her hair to Mercy, recalling their old friendship. Slowly, they're reconciled, and they start writing again. And, Adams can swallow his pride and make up. And he then, in this beautiful denouement, Mercy says, I just have one favor to ask. You're the only one in the world who knows that I wrote The Adulator, that poem that you said was the best poem written about the Revolution, but some guy has taken credit for it, and in the Boston Athenaeum, his name is on the title page. Can you certify I wrote it? Adams says, absolutely. He gets on his horse, rides into Boston, walks into the Boston Athenaeum, and on the title page of The Adulator writes, this was written by Mercy Otis Warren, and you can see Adams's attestation today, which attests to his capacity for friendship and his humility. And then there's his remarkable break and reconciliation with Thomas Jefferson, a familiar story, of course. But what was so striking for me was to see that in the letters that they wrote when they were old, perhaps the most moving and significant correspondence of old founders in that era, what do they want to talk about most after having fought the revolution and created America's two political parties and then reconciled? What they've read recently. And their reading as old men is so inspiring. They would still keeping up the habits of youth, get up early, and read broadly, not just in politics and history, but constantly stretching themselves. And Adams is very excited when he learns that Pythagoras may have traveled in the East and read the Hindu Vedas. And he says that this will show the deep connections between the Eastern and Western wisdom traditions about virtue, and will show that the lessons of the Bhagavad Gita, which is that we should only focus on controlling our own thoughts and emotions rather than being attached to external events and results, which Gandhi summed up in the axiom, renounce and enjoy. Renounce attachment to external events and enjoy eternal freedom and salvation. Adams said that once we could show that Pythagoras traveled in the East, it would show the connection between the Gita and Pythagorean notions of tempering our passions. And then he's so excited to learn that Joseph Priestley lived to complete his commentaries on the Hindus, as they were called, and that the English translation of the Bhagavad Gita had been complete. And he didn't know that it was finished, and Jefferson says, good news, Priestley lived, I've got the book, I'll send it to you. Isn't it remarkable? These two giants want nothing more than access to books and are taking the time to read them and noting their connections. And Adams then sums up his entire mature spirituality in the sentence which he attributes to the hymn of Cleanthe, love God and all his creatures, rejoice in all things. That's Adams's deeply ecumenical statement of mature spirituality. And Jefferson has been reflecting on this for his lifetime and says, he started as a Cicero-like Stoic. He said, at this point in my life, I am an Epicurean. And by that he meant not a pleasure seeker. That was a libel on Epicurus by the Stoics, said Jefferson. Epicureans sought the rational contraction of desire so that they could be tranquilly fulfilled. And that was Jefferson's, that was where he ended. Just beautiful and very philosophically and spiritually inspiring. What of Jefferson and slavery? How was it possible that the man not only who defined the American idea in the shining sentences of the Declaration and inspired the greatest definition of freedom of conscience in the Virginia Bill on religious freedom and founded the University of Virginia, was such a hypocrite on slavery. And what struck me is that Jefferson and the other enslavers from Virginia didn't even try to justify their hypocrisy. There's a really striking and significant quotation from Patrick Henry. He's just given the Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death speech, which I guess we'll be celebrating the anniversary of next year. And Henry says, is it not amazing that I myself, who believe slavery violates natural law, myself own slaves? I will not justify it. I will not attempt to. It is simple avarice. I cannot do with the inconvenience of living without it. Avarice, greed. Avarice is the Latin word. He saw it as a vice. It's the opposite of the virtue, which is frugality and industry. And he recognized, as the other enslavers did too, that it was wrong and immoral, and they just didn't want to give it up because they liked the lifestyle. And in moments of self-awareness, which were less frequent for him, Jefferson acknowledged a version of this as well. He was always criticizing South Carolina and Georgia for their avarice in being addicted to the lifestyle of slavery because they wanted to end the international slave trade later than all the other, than Virginia and the enslaving states that didn't need to import more slaves. And of course, with Jefferson, it just makes the contradiction so glaring because he's denouncing avarice in others and also insisting on the unconstitutionality of passing a debt along from one generation to another. He wants a constitutional convention every 19 years because he thinks laws should expire after 19 years, and he thinks that even passing on a national debt, as Hamilton's Bank would have done from one generation to another, is unconstitutional. And yet he lives wildly beyond his means. He's addicted to this avaricious living at Monticello, which he constructs as a kind of Palladian fantasy of supposed Roman asceticism, and then all with the goal of not passing on his debts to his daughters, and yet the debts are so crushing that his enslaved population has to be sold when he dies, and parents are separated from children, and all of his efforts are in vain. The two children that he freed on his death, of course, are his own children, the two Hemings who had not already escaped, keeping his promise to Sally Hemings in Paris that he would free their children on his death, but he frees no other members of his enslaved population, and their enslavement is a permanent rebuke to his own hypocrisy. And then there's the depths of his racism, and it's familiar, the story, but it was revealed to me through telling the story of Phyllis Wheatley. And Phyllis Wheatley is another example of a great woman in the founding era who was inspired by reading this classical wisdom to write, in her case, the most acclaimed poems of her era. She's brought over as a teenager, she's enslaved and in chains, and yet for some reason her master and mistress allow her to be educated in the schoolroom where their kids are learning the classics. And she's proves to be a poetic genius, and she absorbs the material and she starts writing poems of virtue, including poems addressing George Washington. He thinks that they're so good that he calls her a poetic genius and receives her with great distinction. And then comes the charge, well, she can't have written her own poems. They're too good. So the city of Boston holds a trial, and it's presided over by John Hancock, and Cotton Mather and all the worthies of Boston examine Phyllis Wheatley to determine whether or not she could have written her own poems. And Professor Gates imagines the questions, who was Apollo, or name the nine muses. And she passes with flying colors. This board of examiners certifies that she wrote her own poems. And she goes to London, and she becomes what Professor Gates calls the Oprah Winfrey of her time. She's an international celebrity. Her poems are acclaimed. Washington applauds her, and yet there's one dissenting voice, and that's Jefferson. And in the notes on the state of Virginia, it's Wheatley that he's referring to in that grotesque passage where he says, the poems of Phyllis Wheatley are beneath contempt. She can't have written good poems because she's black, and I suspect that black people are intellectually inferior, he says. I venture this is a suspicion only. He wants to be proved wrong. And then he contrasts Phyllis Wheatley with white poets who were enslaved in Rome, like Terence, and says that white poets can be good and black people can't be. It is a shocking degree of racism on Jefferson's part. It is not shared by Washington and other enslavers who received her with respect, or with Franklin, who applauded her genius as well. And it's just a permanent stain on his legacy that the sage of Monticello was blinded by his racism as well as his hypocrisy. So that's Jefferson. Let me say something about Madison and Hamilton, and then Quincy Adams, and then we'll wrap up. Madison and Hamilton show that, sorry, we must take a moment on George Washington, of course. Washington, as well as Madison and Hamilton, show the connection between personal self-government and political self-government. And if Jefferson gets worse, the closer you look, Washington appears greater. His self-mastery, his mindful struggles with his own temper were magnificently successful and were at the core of his greatness. He had a very hot temper that he was always struggling to control. Ron Chernow, his great biographer, attributed it to his hypercritical mom, who was always nagging him, and he's bristling very impatiently at her importunations. And yet he determines, from his own youthful reading of Seneca, when he was a kid, which he took very seriously, and Seneca, as Cliff knows, has a great essay on anger, which we both were inspired by. Washington is just determined never to show his temper in public. And that amazing moment at Newburgh, when the soldiers are going to rebel because they're not getting the back pay, and Washington mounts a wooden structure called the Temple of Virtue. And he's just had a recitation of his favorite play, Cato, which he loves to have performed for the troops, including the famous line in Addison's translation about the consolations of mild philosophy, which are really the definition of the pursuit of happiness. Washington mounts the Temple of Virtue. He goes to take his speech out to read the appeal to the soldiers for patience. He's appealing for patient virtue, so that wait and Congress will pay you. He struggles to read his notes and famously takes out his reading glasses and apologizes, "Gentlemen, I've grown old in your service and now I'm growing almost blind." And the soldiers weep, and that's because he's showing his frailty with humility. They've never seen him confess weakness before. And it's this magnificent performance of self-mastery. "Never had Washington seemed more great," said an eyewitness. And that's the moments, crucial moments in American history. It's his composure at the Constitutional Convention. He says almost nothing, but his simple self-mastered presence and the fact that everyone knows that he will be president allows both sides to come together. And Washington's final appeal, the farewell address, is a warning to the people about factions, these unreasonable passions or emotions that have risen up. And he says the republic will collapse unless citizens find the self-mastered virtue, by which he means self-control and self-mastery and devotion to education, learning about the principles of liberty so they can defend them, and also learning the habits of deliberation and compromise so they can listen to opposite points of view. Without these virtues, the republic will collapse. And Washington's not sure at the end whether it will succeed. And he and the other founders have grave doubts that it's asking too much to ask citizens to achieve this kind of self-mastered virtue on a large scale. Never before has the experiment been tried. And he doesn't know if it'll work, but that's the key. And that's what makes our work really important. We must answer Washington's call and inspire citizens to learn about the principles of liberty and the habits of deliberation rooted in the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution. And that leads to Madison and Hamilton. And I just read the Federalist Papers in a new light now as a manual for public happiness. The phrase appears repeatedly, and they repeatedly say that the purpose of the state is to achieve public happiness. How? Through encouraging citizens to use reason. Federalist 1. This is the first test in history of whether a republic can be constructed on reason and conviction, not force or violence. Now I understand the definition of faction in a new light. Federalist 10. What's a faction? Any group, a majority or a minority, animated by passion rather than reason, devoted to self-interest rather than the public good. And then Madison is making these extraordinarily sophisticated and important connections between political psychology and political philosophy. And he studied faculty psychology at Princeton with President Witherspoon, and Madison comes up with the idea that just as individuals have passion in the head, reason in the head, passion in the heart, and desire in the stomach, so we have to construct the republic with an energetic executive and a tempering Senate and a passionate or hot-tempered House. And the goal is to achieve the same harmony and balance in the constitution of the state that citizens achieve in their own mind. And a faction is an example of allowing passion to triumph, and that's why the whole system is set up to slow down deliberation, to prevent factions from finding each other or organizing, or by the time they do find each other, because the republic is so big, they'll go home. But the central fear is always demagogues and mobs, passionate factions overcome by unreasonable anger. And that's why Federalist 55 says, in all large assemblies of any character composed, passion never fails to wrest the scepter from reason. Even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. They're very concerned about direct, unmediated democracy, and Madison hopes that the complicated system of checks and balances and horizontal and vertical divisions of federalism will prevent the mobs from organizing and will allow passions to cool. At the in the 90s, the 1790s, Madison gets a trunk full of books from Jefferson from Paris, including Condorcet and the French physiocrats, and he becomes very interested in the new science of public opinion. and starts wondering, how can public opinion be educated and cooled so that it can be governed by reason rather than passion? And Madison's very excited about a new media technology, the broadside press. And he thinks that when complicated arguments, like the Federalist Papers, can be published in the newspapers in the broadside press and distributed across the land, then an enlightened class of journalists and statesmen he calls the literati can slowly allow public reason to diffuse among citizens. And citizens will read the Federalist Papers in coffee houses, and they'll discuss with their representatives. They'll never communicate directly with the president because that would encourage demagogues. And through this deliberative process of public education, by reading the newspapers, public opinion can slowly be perfected and universal reason can prevail. It's sad in the age of Instagram or X or whatever it's called to think of how far we've come from the Madison hope of media technologies that would slowly diffuse reason. And in our age of polarization and enrage to engage and filter bubbles and echo chambers, all of which are the antithesis of the Madisonian hope of public reason, our job and the Republic's future is challenged. But it's very important to talk about how the entire system is designed on the assumption that it is possible to achieve public reason on a broad scale, and that's just what we have to try to do together in our efforts. That leads me to John Quincy Adams. I think he's the one who achieves virtue the most mindfully, and he grows, and he's just so spectacular. First of all, he's getting hit over the head with the need to be virtuous from his mom and dad. And I thought that it could be challenging at times to have a Jewish mom. Imagine having a Puritan mom. And Abigail, ever since he's a kid, are telling him, use your powers of reason to master your unreasonable passions. You know, be careful, don't look at the women in the streets of Paris. And are you using your abilities to the best of their abilities? Abigail quotes the proverb, he who has mastered himself and is slow to anger is greater than he who's taken a village. That's the message that John Quincy's getting. And as a result, he's constantly beating himself up for not using his talents and not doing enough. He's something like 27, and there's an entry in his diary, I'm 27 years old. He's just turned down a US Supreme Court appointment. He's the minister to St. Petersburg. He says, I'm 27, I haven't achieved anything. I'm squandering my talents. I'm spending too much time at the theater. I'm drinking too much. I'm not, my unreasonable passions are overcoming me. He always wants to do more because his injunction is from the classics and from the Bible to be perfect. That's what John told him, quoting the gospel, be perfect. And the pressure is overwhelming. And then the pressure becomes too much, and he's elected president. And he's giving the same lesson to his kid, George Washington Adams, although he's worried that burdening a child with that name is just too much pressure, and it is. And George Washington Adams becomes an alcoholic, and he spirals, and he jumps off a steamship and commits suicide. The pressure is just too great, and Adams is crushed with grief. The world is falling in on him. He doesn't know if he can survive. What does he do? He turns again to Cicero, and he rereads the Tusculan Disputations. He spends a year rereading Cicero. He chooses from the Tusculans a motto, I plant for the benefit of future generations, in the hope that his efforts will come to fruition at some point in the future. And then he reinvents himself as the greatest abolitionist of his age. And it's the most extraordinary story of how this man who hadn't initially been single-mindedly devoted to the abolition of slavery goes back to the House, sponsors a constitutional amendment to end slavery, votes against the gag rule, which prohibits the reading of abolitionist petitions, and becomes centrally devoted to the indestructibility of the Union. And this is another theme that I hope we'll all stress and teach. That 1839 Jubilee on the Constitution address that I started with is all a discussion of the relationship with the Declaration and the Constitution with regard to union. And Adams says that when we, the people, pledged that government had to be based on consent. It was the entire people of the United States exerting our right of revolution as an original matter. When the Articles of Confederation were made in the name of the sovereign states, Adams said, that was a violation of the principles of the Declaration, which were made in the name of the people of the nation. And the error was solved by the Constitution, again ratified in the name of the national people. And in 1839, Adams is denouncing secession and nullification as a violation of the basic principle of the Declaration that in the United States, we, the people of the United States as a whole, are the ones who made the Union and formed government. That devotion to union and nationalism is one that our greatest presidents have carried through, from Quincy Adams to Lincoln to Jackson, who vetoed nullification, to Roosevelt, to Wilson, to the present day. Adams has an amazing death. He's on the floor of Congress and suffers a stroke. He's carried to a couch, and his last words are, "I am composed." And he gets this from Cicero, that the perfectly tranquil man is the one who's composed in body and mind and has achieved that tranquility of soul that the passage from the Tusculan Disputations said defines virtuous and self-mastered happiness. It's a beautiful and meet end for a virtuous man. The wisdom didn't stop with John Quincy Adams, nor did it stop with the classically educated founding generation. It was resurrected by Frederick Douglass, who got the wisdom on the streets of Baltimore, where he paid boys in bread to teach him how to read, and he bought, with bread, a copy of this golden book called the Columbian Orator. And when he read in this book, which had excerpts from Cicero and Seneca and Aurelius and the Enlightenment and Franklin, Douglass felt, first of all, that a light had suffused him when his wicked mistress said he couldn't learn to read. He felt that that was a form of enslavement, almost as grave as enslaving his body. Even worse was the attempt to shackle his mind. And this book opened up the wisdom of freedom, resolved him to become an abolitionist, and he became the greatest abolitionist and freedom fighter of his day. And after the war, he talked of self-reliance and self-mastery, which he attributed to Quincy Adams and to the ancients, and was his definition of the pursuit of happiness. And then, of course, it's so important, as we all know, to see the great freedom fighters, men and women, who invoked the Declaration to ensure that we the people became more embracive and that they were included in the national story after that, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Ida B. Wells, Louis Brandeis, Ruth King on the Mall, all the way up to the present day. This wisdom of the pursuit of happiness, this great inheritance that inspired the founders, does not belong to white men or to the founding generation. It belongs to all of us, and all of us have made it our own. So what can we do to fulfill the mission that we're all resolved to do? I'll just share that my takeaway from this unusual and blessed project that I'm so glad to have been given — I never expected to be spending a year doing this reading or be so fired up about sharing it — was the radically transformative possibilities of deep reading. I hadn't spent 2 hours a day reading for a long time, and I got out of the habit after graduating from college, and just waking up and reading primary text changed my life. And since this project, I've tried to keep it up. I'm still getting up early, not always before sunrise, although I'm trying to. But the main thing is the morning has to be for reading or writing or something creative like poetry writing or whatever. I'm just not allowed to browse or surf. And it's very hard, because I want to, of course, every moment, because I'm as addicted to these devices as many of you are. But just setting a rule, and that Franklin and Pythagoras tell us about that, having a schedule and having rules about what time of day you're allowed to do stuff, allowed me to carve out this morning reading, which is completely transformative. And as I've talked about this project around the country, lots of folks are sharing their stories, because we all know how addicted we are to these devices. And many people also are trying to carve out times for reading and reflection in the morning, and it's just transformative. So I would love, as we think together about our movement to inspire people to learn about the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution, to make deep reading a central part of it, and deep reading of primary texts. And Jane Kamensky was so inspiring 2 days ago when she talked about the importance of reading the primary text. It's very important to tell the stories and to use biography and the figures to engage people and spark their curiosity. And I've tried to do that by talking about how the founders applied that in their lives. But going back to the texts themselves is just urgently important. So let's inspire people, most important of all, to read the Declaration and to read the Constitution, and also to read the other central texts that inspired the big ideas of the Declaration. Liberty, equality, and democracy are Jefferson's three big ideas in the Declaration. Liberty, let's read Otis's speech on the writs of assistance. Equality, Prince Hall, or David Walker, or Frederick Douglass on the Declaration and slavery. Government by consent, the Federalist Papers, the Constitution itself. The list goes on and on. Here's the note of optimism that I promised that I want to end with. These devices are distracting and addictive and polarizing and have done much ill. And yet, it just blows my mind that all of the wisdom of the world is free and online. And when I was a kid, I went with my mom to the Library of Congress. I think the Thomas Jefferson Building is the most beautiful in Washington. And I was so filled with wonder at the thought that all of the books in the world are in that beautiful space. And now I'm carrying them around on my iPhone. And I just can't believe that I was able to do all that reading and write the book lying on my couch at home. And any moment of the day, I can learn and grow and just be exposed to the wisdom of the world. Adams and Jefferson wondering if a book had been translated. Lincoln having to pay by pulling corn for a book he'd spoiled in the rain. Douglass having to buy that book on the streets of Baltimore with bread. It's all free and waiting for us. All we need is the self-discipline to do it. So let's go do it. We're going to do it by telling our stories, by convening at our historic sites, by convenings and beating the drum in our states, by sparking curiosity, by putting the sources and materials and learning materials and convenings all online, and we're working together, and it's so inspiring that we're all here committed to this task. What an honor it is to be part of this movement to inspire learning about the Constitution and Declaration. Could there be anything more important? The founders say no. The Republic depends on us to do our job by telling engaging stories and sparking curiosity in an engaging way to actually bring our fellow citizens in so that we can have they can have the same benefit of and joy of learning from history that we have. So I've got to end just where I began with Quincy Adams, because what a mission statement and call to action it is. So here it is again. This is the principles, the importance of teaching the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution. Lay up these principles then in your hearts and in your souls. Bind them for signs upon your hands, that they may be as frontlets between your eyes. Teach them to your children, speaking of them when sitting in your houses, when walking by the way, when lying down and when rising up. Write them upon the doorplates of your houses and upon your gates. Cling to them as to the issues of life. Adhere to them as to the cords of your eternal salvation. Let's go do it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. I recently completed reading his new book, and I encourage everybody to read it. It is as educational and informative, and I think illustrative of the foundations of the work that we have to do of any piece that I've recently read. So, Jeff, thank you very much for your very inspiring talk that we had here. Now, 2 days ago, I listed 3 words for us to think about as we went through this program. They were inspiring, exploration, and inclusion. If you can't be inspired by Carly Fiorina's speech or Justice John Charles Thomas's remarks that opened us yesterday, well, there's not much we can do for you. If you think about exploration and what Jeff did and Danielle did and others have done to more deeply understand and explore the origins of our nation and what does it mean for us today, that's the work we have to think about. And the thread of inclusion in terms of making sure that all Americans can see themselves and be a part of this. Because everybody's ancestors were here and have been here and made this great nation. And we need to make sure that all of us can see themselves and be a part of this work that's in front of us. I want to add one more word, though, to give you as you leave and think about what we do, and that is impact. We're the choir of the church, or the synagogue, or the temple, or whatever spiritual home you have. When I say that, we're already converted, okay? We're already recognize the importance of this moment and what we have to do. But what we are representatives of the people and the work that must be done. And as we think about impact, there will of course be momentous things that are done that will shape the nation. For example, we saw one yesterday. Ken Burns' film will be a magnificent memento and marking of this moment in our nation's history. But most of the work will be done inside the tapestry that John Charles Thomas described. And that's the work that we're going to do. Harry Smith talked about who we are as an American, culture and people. He gave us insights to who we are, and we know who we are as a people. So the work that must be done to strengthen our democracy and talk about our origin is done in those communities. And as representatives of the cultural institutions and planners from across the country, that's where we have to focus our efforts and energy. There will, of course, be great things that many of this room will do that will have a national impact. But that real impact will happen in our communities and in the places where Americans live their lives every day. That's what made this country, and that's where we will strengthen our democracy and talk about our founding, and that's the work that we have to focus on. Now, meetings like this, as you know, don't happen by simple manner. And it has been an honor and a privilege to work with an incredible team to put this meeting together. And so I'm going to ask three people who are representative of the hundreds of people who have done this work to step forward so that we can recognize them, but recognize that there are a large amount of people behind them. The first, come on, Dana and Keith, come on up here. So Dana Tomlin is the Chief of Staff at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. She has coordinated almost every aspect of this meeting. We're very blessed. Keith Jackson is our Vice President of Hospitality, so if you've liked the food, it is Keith's team that has done a great job. And then Cheryl Wilson, okay? Yeah. And then, so thank you too. And then Cheryl Wilson, I don't see her in the front of the room, but she's probably out, but Cheryl Wilson does a magnificent job for Virginia 250, and we thank her very much. So thank you all very much. No. All right, so there is one more thing that you can attend to. One of the great teaching tools we use at Colonial Williamsburg, and we owe a lot of work to Christy Coleman and others in this room who have had a huge influence on it, is artistic interpretation, where our characters portray people of the past in a very rigorous, researched manner. Last year, of course, we closed with the recreation of the first call for collaboration between the colonies, which came right here from Williamsburg. This year, at 2:30, we will be recreating Virginia's reaction to the port closure at Boston, where the governor dissolved the House of Burgesses, which took Virginia inexorably down the road to revolution and calling for a great Congress in Philadelphia. And so at 2:30, we will be reenacting the dissolution of the House of Burgesses and the march to the Raleigh Tavern, which was Virginia's march down the road to revolution, which occurred 250 years ago this year. So thank you all very much, and we hope to see some of you in the historic area at 2:30.